Hello. My name is Matthias Goertz, and as every month, I'm sharing my monthly COVID update with you. The title is Any Human Out There? So I'm still being Diogenes, the Greek philosopher. You recall, he walks through the marketplace of Athens in daytime with a light in his hand, looking for a human, implying that all these people around him, he does not consider them to be human. So what does it mean to be truly human? Well, here's my take, and of course you're entitled to your own take. Three things seem pertinent to me. One, human is someone who trusts their own mental faculties, their own thinking, their own conscience, their own will. Secondly, they trust their own bodily faculties. That notably includes their own immune system, as well as other functions of the body. And thirdly, what seems pertinent is that a truly human being entrusts themselves to nature, conscious of being part of nature, and to fate. Now, if you're religiously inclined, you may call that providence or something else. If you're Nietzschean, you may call it amor fati, meaning the love of fate. And if you're Heideggerian, you may call that Gelassenheit, letting yourself into life and into being in a way that is somewhat relaxed, perhaps. Letting yourself be and letting it be. Any of these will do, but I think you get the point, right? So that's what I mean by truly human, and that's why I'm like Diogenes walking around in daylight with a lamp and not finding any of these really at this moment, and that's what this is all about. Last month, I talked about paradigm shift, or maybe it was 2 months ago. I mentioned Copernicus, who had the quintessential paradigm shift when he showed that our world, that as far as people then could perceive it, was not, meaning our solar system, first of all, let's say, was not centered on the Earth, but it was centered on the sun. It was heliocentric, the solar system. That's why it's called solar system now. Until that point, most people believed that this system in which we are, of planets in which we are, and the world as a whole, were centered upon planet Earth. And Copernicus showed once and for all that that was not the case. And of course, today we know we are just one tiny little speck in a tiny little solar system, in a tiny little, very average galaxy, in a huge universe that we don't know yet, but this universe may just be one among countless universes. So that was the original paradigm shift, the Copernican revolution. And I talked about other Copernican revolutions since, such as the one done by Kant, for example. I don't want to repeat that, but just to entertain you, since then I came across this wonderful quote in Don Quixote, which I thought I'd share with you. The belly carries the legs, and not the legs the belly. I think that's just wonderful, and it's exactly an example of shifting your mindset to really understand what was going on. And in the case of COVID, of course, I was referring to understanding that not the virus is the problem. It's a very ordinary, probably part of the common cold coronavirus family virus that is in itself harmless. And instead, the problem lies in us. There are a lot of people nowadays, thankfully not that many, but 1% of global population, according to my model, who are living with an immune system that is compromised in such a way that it cannot handle this very basic coronavirus, this common cold coronavirus, well. Although that may only be in the first encounter, and once you've encountered it once, you may no longer have a problem, even those 1% of the population. But the point being, insofar as there is a perceived problem, such as several million people having died in conjunction with this coronavirus, the problem doesn't lie with the coronavirus. The problem lies squarely with us. It's our lifestyle and social choices of wanting to live ever longer, wanting to live unhealthy lives and unhealthy lifestyles that compromise our immune systems. All of these, by the way, are perfectly legitimate. I'm not in any way challenging these wishes of people to die ever, to live ever longer, or to live the lifestyle they choose. I'm not challenging that in any way. That's perfectly fine. I'm just pointing out that it comes with certain risks. And those people who make those choices are better aware of those risks. And if a risk comes home, such as, oh, you are developing pneumonia, do remember that, well, there was probably something in your own choices that made it so. And even if you say, well, I'm just getting older, but I didn't really choose that, it just happens. Yeah, fair enough. But be responsible for your own, for your own getting older, and do not attempt to offload that responsibility to all these other people around you who don't necessarily have the same problem. Right? I think that, so the paradigm shift I was asking for, or that I was proposing, is A, not the virus is the problem, but us humans, and B, amongst us, not everybody is affected. In fact, the vast majority of us are not affected, because our immune system has no problem with this virus, even in the first encounter. So we need to put the onus on, and the responsibility primarily on, the individual who may be affected. I know that could be me, yes. But I, first of all, want to have responsibility for my own body, and not outsource that responsibility to some government or some other people around me who I may not even know. At the moment, we have 8 billion people, 7.9 billion people on this planet being affected by something that actually only affects 1% of all of us in real. So that is completely disproportionate, and that is completely unreasonable and irrational and quite useless. To hamper those other 99% in their daily lives does not actually protect that 1% who require protection in any effective or efficient way at all. There would be much better ways to assist them. Right? And I'm not at all proposing that we don't give assistance to people who want assistance. On the contrary, I would have given a lot more assistance to people who need it or want it. A lot more than what governments have done, who have done very little on the whole, very little. The only thing they've done is pull out the hammer and hammer down on everybody. I'm just saying, instead of pulling out the hammer, why don't you assist those people who actually desire assistance, right? And give them the choice whether they desire your assistance, rather than forcing it upon not only them, but on everybody, including on those probably majority of us who don't really want that assistance. Thank you very much. So yes, there is something about collectivism here, yes, because the virus can spread, or does spread, from one person to another. So it's almost like you make everybody responsible as a spreader, but you're not allowing them to make responsible choices on their own. So it's kind of a perfectly perverse misallocation of responsibilities. It's the wrong way around. And so that's why I said we need another Copernican revolution, which is we have to put everything back up, upside down, rather than the reverse, as we have been for the last 16 months. So anyways, next time you think of paradigm shift, think of Cervantes and Don Quixote. The belly carries the legs, because the belly is where the energy is processed that the legs need to do anything, right? And not the legs, the belly. Isn't that lovely? Okay, starting with our monthly prize awards. The Three Silly Monkeys Prize for Steps Towards Destroying Our Humanity. I had, again, quite a few finalists. Usually it's the same types of patterns, so I feel it's starting to be repetitive. I think I've been doing this for 2 or 3 months now, and it always seems to be the same kind of ways of destroying our humanity. So I don't want to be too repetitive. So what I've done is I've just brought you the one that actually is winning the prize, and that's the European Parliament, which at the beginning of June approved by quite a wide margin, 546 votes to 93 with 51 abstentions, approved a so-called European COVID certificate, insisting that it will not discriminate and da. And of course, the complete opposite is true. Not that the certificate itself discriminates, no, but everybody who wants to is now sort of encouraged to discriminate on the basis of the data or the availability of that certificate. So if you're a EU citizen and you want to move around freely, which is your basic right, you better have a certificate, and you better have 2 jabs or whatever it is that the different countries may require, which, by the way, may differ from country to country. Otherwise, you may not be treated like a human being at all, right? You will be treated like a dog or like I don't know, an aunt or something. So the European Parliament has now institutionalized the biggest discrimination scheme ever invented in human history. I mean, this is like, I said this before, this analogy, this is like, the Jews during the Nazi regime in Germany 70, 80 years ago. They had to wear a yellow Star of David to be recognizable as Jews, so people could more easily discriminate against them, right? Now, this is the same thing, just it affects, this time, not just a small minority of people. This time it affects everybody in the EU. Every single EU citizen is affected by this discrimination. You could say, yeah, it's de facto, it's just a forcing mechanism to force you to get the vaccine. Yeah, you could perhaps put it that way as well. Because you might say, yeah, but you don't get discriminated if you have the vaccines. And first of all, yes, you get positively discriminated if you have the vaccine, as opposed to negatively, but that's still discrimination. Right? Discrimination just means treating one person different than the other, right? So whichever way you turn it, whether you have the vaccination or not, you will be discriminated, right, on the basis of the scheme. And second, yeah, it does, in a way, if you want to be treated like a human being, you are forced to take the vaccine, even against your will, which is in itself contradictory, because in the moment where you're forced against your will to take a vaccine, you're no longer human. So you can't square the circle. This is a fantastic tool to permanently abolish humanity. So there you go. That's a worthy winner, right? The European Parliament, yay, this month's winner. Okay, moving on. Finalist for, sorry, I skipped a page, for our monthly Lady Liberty Prize. This is, remember, the prize for those who take steps towards regaining our humanity. And sadly, this month, there is no finalist. I couldn't find any. Now I may have missed something, and I know there are things happening in various countries, sort of baby steps towards regaining and clawing back at least some of those freedoms that have been suspended. But I didn't come across anything earth-shattering. It's very slow. I mean, the last 2 times, remember the awards, both times went to the United States. The first time to UFC, the organizer of martial arts combats, who were, as far as I could see, among the first to open their events in big stadiums to people without any noteworthy restrictions. So really going back to normal. And the second one went to, I think, 3 Republican governors of United States federal states, Florida, Arizona, Texas, I think those 3, if memory serves, all of whom signed a bill outlawing the use of COVID passports of the type that the European Parliament has just approved. And that's precisely what needs to happen. States and countries and governments need to outlaw these instruments of torture, which they're instruments of torture. Right? And, I mean, it's torturing if you are standing in front of some event and you are not allowed in, right? Because you don't have this passport. Right? That's torture. Right? So no winner this time for this lovely lady. Hopefully next month. Now I'm introducing a third prize. Maybe this is a one-off. Let's see. Maybe we will have a lot more of this coming in the future. I call this the U-turn prize. And this prize is awarded for the most notorious government U-turns. Now you may think, oh, my government did a lot of U-turns. No, but I mean profound U-turns, not just, tactical U-turns. I mean, let's call them strategic U-turns, or at least in the messaging about COVID. And I have one finalist. This finalist, and as you know, usually I refrain from talking about the state in which I'm presently based in order to protect myself, but I could not resist this time. This is the multi-government task force in Singapore. So multiple ministries coming together to evaluate the COVID approach and then sort of progress the strategy for COVID-19. And now this is very interesting. The main element of this is what makes the sort of the U-turn is that they're basically going from presenting COVID as sort of the most dangerous thing that's ever happened to human beings to, oh, this is another flu. I mean, that's quite snappy, right? Until yesterday, the other day when they came out, basically everybody was talking about COVID being so dangerous, and we had war with COVID or with SARS-CoV-2, right? And all of a sudden they come out and say, well, actually, we have to live with it. It's endemic. Yeah, we know that since 15, 16 months ago, we knew that. Yes, we have to live with it. We knew that 16 months ago. Yes. So, I mean, one element of this is that they present something as new thinking that is completely old thinking. I mean, that has been known, at least to me and my audience, for the last 16 months. And I think to many other people as well. But they're gonna, oh, we've now realized after 16 months that this is endemic and we have to live with it. And they use, as I think quite clever analogy, they use the flu. Everybody can relate to it. Yeah, some people die of flu every year. Yes, some people get seriously ill of flu, but we are so used to it. And the proportion of the people who actually get seriously ill and die is modest, and the likelihood, therefore, of an individual person being hit by it is low. So we live with flu without any kind of measures, right? We offer those who want it an annual booster jab. but we don't force anybody, we don't check on anybody, we don't use this as a control mechanism of where people can move and what they can do, et cetera, right? So there are basically no specific measures in place to protect people from the flu. So these, this task force came out and said, well, this is the new, COVID is the new flu. I mean, that's quite extraordinary. It's directionally correct, actually, right? I mean, I've been saying it's not a flu, it's even less harmful than that. It's just a common cold, right? But directionally, the comparison is the flu has been made early on. And then people who made that analogy were hammered down on, how dare you compare this with the flu, where obviously the comparison isn't completely wrong. In fact, it's a much better comparison than to compare this with some kind of war or something. Right? So they've come around to what is directionally the right view. It took them 16 months, so they're not particularly quick. But they've come around, nevertheless, to what is directionally the correct view. But what's amazing is that they can do that on a dime. They can turn on a dime, and nobody asks any questions, because normally you would think, well, if all of a sudden the government says that's this completely new story, won't there be people questioning, well, if this is the story, why for the last 60 months did you tell us a completely different story? I mean, was it wrong, that different story? But in a place like Singapore, with a population that does not ever challenge the government, the interesting thing is, in an authoritarian regime, a government can just change direction like that. And it doesn't even raise eyebrows. There was virtually no reaction in the media. Of course, the media all state controlled, right? And I'm not on Facebook. Maybe there are some Facebook groups where you have some reaction. But as far as there's no reaction, right? As if it's the most normal thing on earth that you go from here to here in like no time. And that, I think that is exceptional and extraordinary, right? I mean, I was really amazed. I mean, even though I've been in Singapore for a long time, I mean, I thought I know this government and how they operate, and they've done this before, but this was quite extraordinary. How they can almost in passing completely reverse the story, the narrative that they've been telling. Now, the second part of this is they then buffer it immediately. So they basically, without people even maybe noticing, they've completely changed direction in how they view the situation and how they intend to address it going forward. And luckily, they've gone from a very mistaken view of this to a much corrected view of this. So that's good in a way, right? I should be happy with that. I'm just highlighting them, because in a democracy where you have some free media, and, even of a low quality, some people would ask questions about how come you all of a sudden say something completely different? Does it either what you said before was just wrong, and you're basically admitting that you were wrong, or there would have to be a completely new set of insights, which there are none. There are no new insights. For many months now, there's no new insights, right? So we knew all of what they're saying as an argument. We knew that 15, 16 months ago. So the only thing we didn't know is how quickly do we get the vaccines. Right? We didn't know that 15, 16 months ago. But everything else we knew already. So, but there's no questioning of that. That's very interesting. But the other part that I find interesting is that they then immediately go and buffer it. Because if you then read the small print, they call it new normal. They don't call it back to normal. And the new normal is, well, despite of what we just said, which is that this is basically just another flu for us now, we nevertheless continue using all these measures, that we don't use for co-influenza. So they immediately contradict themselves as if, they want to bury the big message, which completely changed our perspective and our strategy, among a lot of details that will make the average, Singaporean who may be still very worried about this virus, having been told for 16 months how worrying it is, to tell, oh, but don't worry, we have all these measures still, right? So it's a U-turn that is camouflaged as if everything remains the same. It's a very strange communication. We are treating this like the flu, but we aren't. So it's like it's not a U-turn, it's a flip-flopping. And they flip-flop so fast, you can't tell. And so I think that's brilliant. These people are obviously intelligent and they know how to communicate to the people that they have been brainwashing for the last 50 years. They know exactly how to feed information to them and how to, they want to open up Singapore again because economically Singapore is suffering and losing competitiveness, and they don't like that. But they can't say that to their people, right? So they're having this really quite creative way of communicating what is basically a radical U-turn, but packaging it such as if it's, oh, don't worry, we'll still do all these good things, and step by step, and so it's a very interesting communication that you can only have in an authoritarian country. In fact, a totalitarian country, right, where the government controls everything. Nowhere else could you have this kind of communication. I mean, if you were in North Korea, then the Mr. Kim, he could just say, shoop, without even doing the camouflaging and the buffering, right? In Singapore, there's a bit more openness, I think, than in North Korea. They do the flip-flopping or the U-turn, but then they buffer it and camouflage it nicely and package it in such a way that every Singaporean will find it palatable. So fascinating. I don't know. Maybe we'll have more of these U-turns. I mean, today, it just so happens, just a few hours ago, I saw in the news that the Australian Prime Minister said something like, well, we have to go through some stages to get back to some kind of normal. That was new also. And that he talked about Australia being the victim of its own success. This is the kind of thing where I almost fell off my chair, right? I mean, Australia has been the most Nazi of all Western democracies, right? They don't even let their own citizens come home. I said before, I think even Hitler had not had that idea. I mean, maybe for the Jews he did, but not for other citizens. to not even allow your citizens, to return home, which is the most basic right of citizenship, if you ask me. So there's nothing more basic than that. And he says we are victim of our own success, right? I mean, the disastrous destruction of Australian rights, of the rights of Australian citizens. I mean, it couldn't be worse. And the guy talks about success. Yeah, successful in destroying Australian rights. Well done. But there you go. So people, especially in these countries that have been pretending that you can exterminate this virus, or at least you can sort of keep it at bay and outside of your little island, whether your little island is Australia, which is also a little island, it's a big island, there's very few people. There's mostly kangaroos, I think, or New Zealand, or Taiwan, or Singapore, or Hong Kong, which is kind of like an island, or South Korea, which is kind of like an island. Japan is an island, right? I mean, you have all these island nations. China is sort of a big island, who say, oh, we can keep, if we can't destroy it outright, we can keep it at a very, very low level. And they've been doing that for 16 months and calling that a success, right? And they all now, sooner or later, will get to the point where they say, wait a minute, maybe that's not so brilliant after all, right? So they're starting to reach the point that I talked about in my letters to Merkel last April. So, 14 months, 15 months ago. That's not very quick in terms of learning, but they are slowly getting to that point. Now, what that means in detail, it's anybody's guess. I mean, it could actually get worse before it gets better, if it ever gets better, because they may want to open up, but still they may just invent new ways of micromanaging their citizens. So that is an open question. But I think in terms of it's slowly sinking in that you cannot win a war with a virus. I mean, you can be lucky, like in SARS-1, that particular virus was malfunctioning. It did not transmit well from human to human. It had a hard time transmitting itself for structural reasons that had to do with the virus. So it came probably from some mammal, and it did not adapt well enough, quick enough to humans to survive. But that was not thanks to some kind of glorious measures taken by countries. That was just simply that virus probably wasn't effective enough to survive on human beings, whereas this one obviously is. And with every mutation, or with every new variant, it's getting better, right? Obviously, by definition, every new variant will be more transmissible than the previous ones. Otherwise, it would not come to the fore at all. So we are currently talking about the Delta or the Indian variety being the one that's coming to the fourth, and yeah, just because obviously it needs to beat all other variants in terms of transmissibility. Otherwise, it will either not survive at all, or it will just become a niche phenomenon in some geographic niches. Perhaps that's possible, but it could not possibly become dominant in the host population, which is us humans, unless it is at least as effective in transmitting itself and reproducing itself as are the previous ones. So by definition, every new variant that comes to the fore and it sort of rises onto our radar screen, by definition is quicker than the previous ones, right? So no surprises. I'm just saying that because sometimes you get people in the media, oh, this one is faster than the previous one. Yeah, of course it's faster than the previous one, otherwise you wouldn't notice it. So, yeah. Anyway, so we'll have that. There will be constantly new ones, and they will, by definition, become ever better adapted to us. And we've now wasted, not fully wasted, but partially wasted the last 16 months in learning to adapt to it. Just like the virus has to learn to adapt to us, we have to learn to adapt to it. And the virus is well ahead of us. Because I would say our measures have been far more effective in preventing us humans from adapting than they have been effective in preventing the virus from adapting. So it's sort of shooting yourself in your own leg kind of situation. And we've been shooting into our own leg for the last 15 or 16 months. And I think more and more those governments, which I call the new normal governments, meaning those who have been trying to pretend to themselves and to their people that somehow they can keep this virus away, at bay. They are slowly waking up to the fact. Again, it's not an empirical fact maybe until recently, but conceptually, we knew this 16 months ago that this will not be possible. Right? Conceptually, it's not possible. I think they are slowly waking up to it. And maybe the problem is not that they don't think at all. The problem is just simply they don't think conceptually or logically. The only things they can process in their mind are empirical data. Maybe there's something fundamentally wrong with our education systems. I don't know. People seem to note empirical data, right? And now 15, 16 months of trying to hammer down on the virus. And in Australia now they have lockdowns again. And it will just continue, right? They will have lockdowns forever, right? Not all the time, but repeatedly they will have to pull out the hammer. If you have a hammer strategy, you will never be able to stop hammering. Never. Virus will always come back at some point in some way, right? So after hammering 4, 5, 6 times, I mean, maybe their biceps is getting tired. But no, so I think people seem to be able to learn based on empirical evidence. 4 times, 5 times, virus coming back again. 6 times, virus coming back again. 7 times. So at some point, maybe even for a politician, something clicks and they say, somehow this is not working. One phrase here somewhere in this article here that about Singapore was, or maybe it was in a related article, I don't remember, but somewhere I read, oh, people are getting wary of these measures. Well, we knew 16 months ago that people would be wary of these measures. I mean, come on. Of course they're getting, I mean, yeah, so, but politicians only start reacting when it gets to boiling point, maybe, maybe they're like, okay, it's starting, I mean, our position's getting so shaky, we have to do something about it, right? Instead of not going down the wrong route, obviously wrong route to start with, right? Which would have been much easier. But I don't think politicians really care whether they're on the right or wrong route. They don't. I mean, for them, the right route is the one that keeps them in power, right? Everything else is secondary, right? As long as everybody believes they're on the right route, that's the right route, right? Because if people support them, and, then there's no threat to their position and their power. Anyway, so yeah, so maybe since Australia is now talking differently than before, maybe we'll have more of these U-turn prices in the next few months. I'll be looking out for them, or maybe this is just a one-off. In this extreme way, this can really only happen in a authoritarian regime, so not elsewhere, because I mean it wouldn't be possible to to make this U-turn and survive as a politician, because too many people would say, wait a minute, are you telling us that you lied to us all along? And the answer is yes, of course, politicians always lie, right? If occasionally they say the truth and nothing but the truth and the whole truth, then only because in that particular moment, the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth just happens to suit their purpose. That's the only reason they will do that, right? That can happen, but that's purely coincidental. All right, and the winner is the multi-ministry task force, and I've covered the faces because I don't want to be accused of pointing fingers at anybody. I know who they are. Yeah. Scenarios, well, nothing new. Guess where we are? Ever deeper into the fractured world. Virus is becoming ever more insignificant, and our global measures are becoming ever more ineffective and destructive. Even Singapore government has now noticed that destructiveness. You see, that's the point about the U-turn. Maybe they are not yet noticing that the virus is becoming insignificant, but maybe to some degree they are, right? But even if they keep the storyline up that, the virus is dangerous, but we just have to have a different policy, at least they're starting not wanting to go ever deeper down into this fractured world whole. And maybe Australia is the same. We'll see over the next few weeks and months. Tracking what's actually the case out there. Okay, I've once more downward adjusted the global infection level. Now this was triggered initially by Peru. Peru, interesting case. Government came out with a new estimate of the COVID fatalities that was round about 2.5 times higher than the previous. In my model, I also had a multiplier for Peru, but maybe based on some previous communication or based on excess mortality figures that they had published late last year. I don't remember which one, but I had a multiplier of 1.4 in my model, but they came out and said it's 2.5. So that 2.5 times as many COVID fatalities than officially reported. That by itself wasn't really so astounding to me, because remember, I used to have for the whole world a multiplier of about 2.5. So one country like Peru being exactly in that range per se is not surprising to me. However, because I had a 1.4 in my model that I thought I had gotten from that same government, I was a bit surprised that the government so significantly revised those figures. I mean, governments from time to time do come out and revise figures, and that's perfectly valid if they have better figures. Of course, that's the right thing to do, and for my modeling, that's useful because it gives me new data. But I just hadn't expected them to go from a factor of 1.4 to a factor of 2.5. If you plug in that factor, then all of a sudden, based on my IFR that I was assuming, Peru would have more than 100% infection level, and that's not possible in the definition of this infection level. This infection level, the maximum can be achieved is 100%, meaning every single person in that country has been infected at least once. That's the definition of it, right? And the maximum of that can be only 100%. So in the model, all of a sudden, it was more than 100%, so that could not be right. So taking the multiplier that the government had communicated as a given, I said, well, what does it mean? So I looked at, I tried to get some details about how this multiplier came about. And there wasn't a lot of detail, at least not that I could get my hands on. But what became a bit clear from a few newspaper articles or commentators commenting on that was that apparently the breakdown of the healthcare system was quite atrocious in Peru, and there's a general view that a lot of people died unnecessarily. They didn't really die because of the IFR, the natural IFR of the virus, but because of a lot of mismanagement and mistakes, and no oxygen available here and there, and no beds available, and no ICUs available, and so on. Which made me think that, first of all, that my weighing factors that I use to differentiate different types of countries in terms of their local IFR. So I have my global average IFR, which until last month was 0.19%. But then I scale that for different countries based on, I think, 4 criteria. Proportion of the population that is above 65, proportion of the population that is obese, proportion of the population that has diabetes, and number 4, a rating of the healthcare systems. Recognizing that the IFR does interact with the quality of the healthcare system. So some of that differentiation in healthcare systems across different countries are built into the local IFR, right? But it had been the least weighty of those 4 factors. The weightiest by far is the age categorization. What proportion of the population is above 65? That's the weightiest of the 4 factors. The quality of the healthcare system, which I used some UN ranking for that, and converted the ordinal ranking into some kind of factors. This is all back of the envelope, so very, very rough and ready, right? But just to acknowledge that there is an impact on the IFR in each country from the quality of the readiness of the healthcare system, and to put them into buckets. I didn't, not too detailed, but just 5 or 6 buckets of countries, and they get different factors. And I looked back at that and I thought, well, maybe I was a bit too underestimating the effect of the healthcare system, because the story about Peru made me think, oh, there may have been a very large number of people dying because of the healthcare system malfunctioning. More than my my little weighting in my model would suggest. And the other thing I remembered that around about a year ago, the World Health Organization published, or a team of researchers, I think, under the domain of the World Health Organization, published a very interesting study on Africa. Actually, I think the most interesting World Health Organization study that I've seen on this matter, which used a methodology not dissimilar to mine to get to an IFR for Africa. And the biggest difference between their calculation and mine was that they put much more emphasis on the healthcare systems in the different places. And they scaled the IFR very, very significantly based on the quality of the healthcare system. And back then, a year ago, I was dismissive of that. Said, no, I don't think the healthcare system will have such a huge impact. I mean, especially in Africa, where you don't have that many cases anyway. Yeah, the healthcare systems are maybe not so well built up, but they also don't have so many cases in the population because on the other three factors, they're all low in most countries. So not South Africa, not some of the northern, Mediterranean shore countries, but the rest of Africa, by and large, there's low proportion of 65 and up, they have low proportion of obesity, and they have low proportion of diabetes on the whole, right? Talking in general, right? So I said, back then, I said, no, these other factors mean that a relatively small fraction of people even has serious symptoms. And therefore, I don't think that the poor quality of the healthcare system in many of those countries, I mean, relatively speaking, I'm not trying to be judgmental here, relatively less well prepared healthcare systems, that will have such a big impact. So I was conceptually sort of arguing with myself about that World Health Organization report and dismissing the weight they had put onto the healthcare system. And I changed my mind on that, at least not maybe fully, not just mimicking exactly what they had done. They had access to much more detailed data for those African countries that they cover than I do. But I took the general gist of what they said seriously and said, okay, maybe I have to give more weight to the quality of the healthcare system, right? And so I did that, and that leads to, countries with, this very solid healthcare system, mostly Western countries or rich Asian countries, that brings their IFR locally down a bit, and conversely, countries with relatively poor healthcare systems, it pushes the IFR up. This affected Peru. It also affected, for example, Brazil. Remember last time I talked about, Brazil is soon to hit 80% penetration, but they continue to have many, many fatalities. And I say, if they continue like this, then that may force me to increase my IFR because Brazil is sort of hitting that boundary, right? Remember I said that? So it wasn't actually Brazil, it was Peru who did that, but it happened. I'm coming to my IFR in a moment. But so the first step was to say, well, let me put more weight on the healthcare system. And that scales Peru, Brazil, Russia, some other countries down in terms of, or rather it increases their IFR, so it therefore reduces their penetration with infections. And thereby I was starting to get Peru back in line. I mean, as I said, it cannot be above 100% penetration, so it had to be pushed below 100%. And so I did that significantly with recalibrating the impact of healthcare. But I also allowed in Peru quite a large number of deaths just from sort of excess mortality due to poor policy choices, although I cannot define what they are. And still, I felt, this really still, the penetration number, the implied penetration number was high. 90% and higher. And that really got me to say, no, I now have to readjust my implied global IFR back up. Remember, over the last 6 or 9 months, I've been slowly trending the IFR down because the data allowed me to do that. But now we've reached a point where for the first time I've pushed it back up a little bit. So instead of 0.19, I've pushed it to 0.2%. So 1 percentage point higher, which is significant. And that gives me a credible picture, but that means that overall globally, it presses the penetration number, the calculated penetration. Remember, this is just a model. In the model, it presses the calculated penetration number down. And that's why for the second time in a row, you're seeing the global infection, the estimation of the global infection level go down. In real life, out there, it cannot go down. It can only go up or stay the same if there was no further activity, but it cannot go down. Only in a model. And remember I said, I could now retroactively recalculate all the previous months and lower so that it would be a monotonous a rising curve, but I am just too lazy to do that. So I'm just allowing myself to show you a graphic of how the assumptions are sort of fluctuating, even though recognizing it out there in real life, the numbers cannot go down, they can only go up. So just bear with me on that. So this is just at any given point in time, meaning the first of the month, my best estimate of what it is, right? And that estimate can go up and it can go down. That's because I'm refining the assumptions. Okay, so we had 60% global penetration. Reported cases is just under 3%. So the estimated penetration is about 20 times higher than the reported. Remember that multiple of 20 or 21 is trending down, which is quite natural because countries over time just do more testing, find more cases. The early stage, only cases were found that were severe. So people basically go to hospital and then they're getting a COVID test, SARS-CoV-2 test, PCR test, typically at that time. And then they might be positive and then they would show up in the statistics, right? So only a very small fraction of those people who were infected were discovered to be infected. That percentage has gone up over time because more countries use more testing. And today we use not just PCR testing, which takes several days to process in a laboratory. We use all kinds of other like instantaneous tests that may be slightly less reliable, but still pretty reliable. And that just allow us to do a lot more testing. So there's a whole testing mania out there in many countries, which leads to a ever higher proportion of cases being actually detected, right? Which explains why this multiple has been trending down, and now we're at about 20. But that is basically what's happened in the model. And you see that also reflected, of course, in the fatality numbers. Fatalities are slightly up. Calculated excess mortality is up by more, and that's because of that special effect of Peru, because Peru had such a high excess mortality factor all of a sudden that I hadn't reckoned with, that I had to recalibrate the whole number for excess mortality. Yeah. Now you might say, really, based on just one country, should that have such a big impact? Yeah, it's a good question. I would wish there were 2-3 more countries coming up and saying, oh, actually, our numbers are much higher by this and this factor. Because then I could start saying, oh, here's the sort of the typical range of multipliers that I'm getting from these new government insights, right? So 15, 16 months into the thing, they're really re-looking at their recordings, their statistics, and they're finding a lot of fertilities. And in some countries more than in others, of course, because some countries have been very accurate, probably, in measuring this, and others less so. And so over time, if there were more countries forthcoming, in addition to Peru, and remember, there had been a few countries from time to time in the past coming forth with these types of numbers. So Peru isn't the first one. It was just such a large discrepancy between what they said last month and what they had previously said, that made it trigger these changes in my model. They are not the first country to update the fatality figures, right? But if you had more of those, especially from the so-called less developed countries, that would be very helpful for our model, and it could swing the model up or down. I don't know, right? But it would help us to calibrate it ever more closely to data that governments have really spent some time analyzing and gathering, right? So it would make every time this happens, it makes the model a little bit more robust, or the assumptions rather. So I welcome that, but so I decided, yes, even based on just one data point from Peru, because my policy so far has always been, when the government came out with these types of numbers, I've taken that seriously. I've taken them at face value. Yeah, I mean, except in totalitarian states, which I'm not really measuring at all, right? Because I just don't believe whatever they say. I don't believe, right? It may even be true, but I still don't believe, right? Because I don't have any basis on which to trust what they say. But in most countries, if the government comes out and says, if we looked at our figures and here's the new estimate, then I take that, right? But there's no reason to me now, in the case of Peru, just because it's a bit more extreme, the difference, to say, oh, just one country, I kind of ignore that or I put it aside. No, I'm using that. So, and that creates these swings. But maybe, there will be more countries coming forth with better data, and, each time I will happily then build it in. And as I said before, the aspiration is just to make sure the model is still consistent with whatever new data I get, right? So when Peru gave me that new data, and it turns out with that new data in my model, penetration of infections goes above 100%, then I know that cannot be the case. So something in the model will have to give. And then that triggers me then thinking, okay, what is it? And this is gut feel to some degree. I mean, this is no more than gut feel, but what are the levers that I'm using, and which ones do I feel comfortable, turning, right, and modulating and fine tuning, right? So this time, thanks to Peru and the stories around Peru, I fine-tuned the impact of the quality of the healthcare system on the IFR. And secondly, I also upped the IFR by 1 percentage point. Those are the two things that the new Peru data triggered. Let's see, next month, maybe there will be something again that will trigger another review. Okay, the other thing I've been mapping, if you recall, is, remember, in February or so, I constructed this green curve based on the case of Sweden, a Northern Hemisphere country with clear seasonality. And I said, okay, based on what I know about Sweden, this seems to be the sort of the ideal curve for COVID proliferation. It's seasonal. It kind of peaks in late December or early January. This is fatalities, actually let's say late January. So the infection activity peaks in late December, and then the fatalities peak 3 weeks later or 4 weeks later. Right? So so there's a peak in late December, and then there's sort of a low point in in late June or July, August, the summer months, the virus lies low, and then come autumn, 21st of September, which is by convention the beginning of autumn in the Northern Hemisphere. Lo and behold, the activity starts going up again. So I remember I chose Sweden as the base country because Sweden had relatively limited interventions, government interventions. So it gave me the most natural data available to me. In the early stage, Sweden, it's well known, made significant tactical mistakes around their old folks' homes. A lot of people, maybe a few thousand people, died, frankly, unnecessarily, because the government did not provide them with oxygen, or did not provide those old folks' homes with oxygen. Maybe based on the general philosophy of saying, well, each old folks' home has to manage these things locally, and the government doesn't really intervene in those sort of grassroots, healthcare operations. And lo and behold, many of them were not capable in the short term, anyways, to do the right things. And it probably would have helped to have government centrally, procure the right equipment, et cetera, and get it to those places fast. That probably would have helped. So there were some tactical errors. So therefore, I'm saying, well, that curve, because of quite a lot of fatalities that were sort of strictly speaking unnecessary, the ideal curve should be lower than that. But then, come autumn, by that time, Sweden had learned, how this works, and they had equipped their, old folks' homes, and care homes, and hospitals, etc. You would expect the curve to really be the natural curve. There was not a lot of reason to assume the curve would be anything other than the natural curve, right? So that allowed me then to model this sort of uptake here in autumn, and then we saw a peak in late December or so, or early January. But just around the time when it peaked, government did impose measures. And I think that was driven not so much because of the significant caseload, because that was already peaking at that time. I mean, visibly peaking. So, I mean, if it was bound to maybe stay high for a little while and then start coming down. But I think what really triggered these measures was the advent of vaccines, because in the moment where you know you have vaccines that are effective and they are available, it is much harder to say, oh, but out of principle, we are not going to do any measures that slow down the virus, even though we now have an effective means of protecting those who need protection from falling severely ill. That becomes much harder to defend. So the philosophy of the government, which had been we rely on each individual to do the right thing, I think, as you know, I believe was profoundly the correct way of thinking about it. But in the moment where you have a means at hand that is really effective, and you can, but you need a bit of a window of time to administer it, because you can't administer it to everybody who needs it in like one day. It takes a few months to roll out, even in a very efficient place like Sweden. In that kind of scenario, I think it is understandable that there was pressure on the government to say, we now really need those measures because it will patently save lives, right? You know, I'm arguing you can't save lives, only God can save lives, but you can extend, prolong lives with these measures, yes. And so there will have been that pressure, and I think the government sort of gave into that pressure, and you know, that is, to me, is acceptable, yeah. It's not that I'm such an ideologue about freedom that I say, no matter what, freedom cannot temporarily be suspended if there is a really good reason. I think if there's a really good logical reason to suspend freedom, and it's clearly for a short period of time and, you know, has a clear positive impact, then, you know, I think that can be argued about. And I think that was the situation here in Sweden. And I think they did it very well, because if you look at the data, you know, this white area below the green curve here around between January and April or May, that's basically lives saved, extended, right? And they avoided the what I call the yo-yo effect. They didn't hammer down so much that you eventually have to let go, and then it shoots up again. You see it tapers off, and it's now pretty much exactly on the green line. So exactly where the model, I mean, this is not even a model, it's just a conceptual rendering of what it ought to be. And it hits precisely that green curve. So in Sweden, by relying for a long time on individual responsibility, and then bringing in a select set of measures just at the right time, when it really, thanks to the vaccines having arrived, when it really actually could have a positive effect, but only to the degree that, you know, it allowed for that effect, and it bought them a few months of time to roll out the vaccinations. And I mean, I now anticipate, hopefully, in the next month or two, that the Swedes will abolish pretty much all of these measures. If they don't, then we have a problem, because then Sweden will have fallen into the same trap as almost everybody else, which is you create these measures, you think they're temporary, and you can't get rid of them anymore because you tie yourself so much as a politician, right? Or even as a general public, you tie yourself so much to those measures. So it's a bit early to celebrate Sweden here, but as of today, it looks like they've got it right. They were not dogmatic in the sense that, oh, no matter what, we will not affect, not impact, will not change our conceptual thinking, even with the advent of vaccines. No, they were flexible enough to say, okay, now that the vaccines are there, it changes the picture, and therefore we have to reevaluate the relative pros and cons of the different positions between human rights and freedoms versus for short term, if we give up some of those rights very carefully, we can possibly save quite a number of lives, right? And that's the plausible and logical consideration. If that's done, within a freely elected parliament and with, the media, reporting in a quality way about it, then that can be, a very good outcome. So, so in Sweden, it looks, as of today, it looks like they got this right. Or I wouldn't say they got it right, because there's not one single right answer to anything, right? But it seems to me they got the balance. They are one of the few countries that actually balanced things. Almost all countries have no balance at all. This is completely one-sided, as if our freedoms and rights just simply don't matter. Sweden is really different. They really weigh very carefully, with a lot of hesitance to give up any of those basic rights, even for a short period of time. A lot of resistance, a lot of hesitance, and that is a healthy democracy, in my view, and it's almost the only one, as I've said before. But a democracy then also has to be able to say, well, under certain circumstances, it may be rational to give up some of these rights in the short term if we have a significant upside. Right? And that's, I think, what they've essentially done, based on what I see. I'm not following the conversations in the Swedish parliament. I don't speak Swedish. I don't read the Swedish newspapers or anything. I'm just saying this on the basis of the data and this conceptual curve that I created. Now, Germany, remember, a bit different. Virus came there more slowly than Sweden. They had, for whatever reasons, they had much less cases per capita in the early stage. The pattern is essentially the same. You probably had a bit. They had one thing that is different, that in Germany, a lot of the measures over the summer were kept in place when the Swedes were fairly free, right? The Germans were fairly restricted, which meant that the summer activity in Germany was extremely low. There were almost no cases. And unfortunately, or whatever, luckily, I don't know, or strangely, just when autumn came, people had gotten so tired of these restrictions that the government sort of felt under pressure to ease some of these restrictions, just, if you like, at the wrong time, right? In autumn, if anything, you want to start putting them in place, right? But they had them in place all summer where they were not needed at all, as the Swedish figures show, and had no impact, right? So if there's no viral activity anyways, because the virus just simply during the summer months doesn't do very much, then all these measures that Germany imposed in terms of travel restrictions and movement restrictions and whatnot, they were all in vain. And then they let go a little bit just under pressure from different corners, from businesses, from from citizens, etc. They let go, and boom, you get this yo-yo effect into winter and overshooting, right? So the German figures overshot the green curve, unlike in Sweden, where they pretty much did not, which then forces you to bring out the big hammer again, and they hammered again just right after Christmas, so a little bit before the Swedes, and they hammered much more. The Swedes did a very fine-tuned kind of response. The Germans hammered, and yeah, of course the hammer drives down the cases, and with them also the fatalities. This data here is fatalities. But again, you can't sustain these heavy restrictions forever, and you start loosening again, and people just start disregarding these rules, etc., because they just have had enough of it. And so you have another yo-yo effect, not as strong, but you have another yo-yo effect here when some of the measures in April or so were loosened. And so you have, again, an overshooting. So the German numbers since April or so have been above the green curve. Remember, in Sweden, they are not, right? In Germany, they are. Now, you could now say, well, the integral over this white area is bigger than the integral over this gray area that exceeds the green line. Yeah. So someone might say, yeah, but net, we've still saved some lives. Yeah, but at at what cost to your basic values, right? And it's not finished yet. You know? I mean, we'll see how over the next few weeks whether Germany remains among the above the green curve. I mean, I don't really expect it, because no matter what you do, the virus will just in the summer will lie low normally, right? But I said before, half jokingly, that if you suppress the virus during their main season, when they normally do their thing, they will just extend their season, right? So Germany has now, and not only this virus, but of course, when you do these measures, not only do you suppress this particular virus, you suppress all the other common cold viruses and influenza viruses that, you know, all those that are seasonal, you suppress those as well, right? So you've just simply extended your winter season, if you like, your viral activity season by a month or 2 or 3, we don't know yet, but you know, potentially by a long shot, right? By a long time. So Germany may just experience now continued fatalities well above what the green line, the seasonal line, would have otherwise anticipated. And so by the end of it, when we reach 21st September, let's see whether the integral over the white space below the green curve is really bigger or significantly bigger than the integral over the gray space above the green line here, right? Or whether they just even each other out, which would mean you haven't gained anything except you've just shifted things a little bit. So yeah, you've gained a few weeks or months for a few individuals, but not more than that, at a very high cost. Now, the other thing I should, and Germany had a late vaccine kick in though. Now the vaccination program in Germany is up and running, and you know, most people who really need it by now have been vaccinated. So actually this curve can only come down to the green level. I mean, it's very hard to imagine it would not. Maybe by next month it will, you know, no longer be visible above the green line. Now, the real litmus test for this whole concept that I'm presenting here, as I said, is come the next autumn, the next regular seasonal cycle. We don't know yet how the disruption of the seasonal cycle through these measures will impact the next cycles. We don't know that yet. I mean, they may be delayed, those next cycles, and they may no longer kick in on the 21st of September, but maybe a week or 2 or 3 later. That we don't know, and that we need to just sort of be open-minded about. But really what we're expecting is that the fatalities never really go up again. They go up somewhat. If there's a lot of activity, there will always be some people left who hadn't yet been exposed and who may still be hit, you know, fatally, right? So the fatality figures will go up a little bit in autumn, but much less than the green curve suggests. That's you know, that's what the vaccines do, or the natural herd immunity. But in Germany, they're far from natural herd immunity. But some countries where they are at herd immunity, that's what you expect, right? The season comes, and the uptick in fatalities is low. Look at South Africa right now. They're now in the middle of their seasonal cycle, probably because the southern hemisphere. So now it's like just winter. So just about now, the seasonal activity, if the southern hemisphere mirrors the northern hemisphere, which I don't know for sure, but I assume it does. And even recognizing South Africa is not that far from the equator, but I think it does have climate zones that do have that seasonality, where most of the people actually live. They don't live in the desert where you don't have that seasonal phenomenon, right? They live mostly along the coastline and in those parts of the country that are, you know, moderate climate zones. And so you will have that seasonality. And if southern hemisphere countries mirror northern hemisphere, then it means they've just sort of hit the beginning of winter, and we are very close to the peak. By the end of June or early July, that just about now, you would expect the peak in South Africa. And because I've been saying they have reached herd immunity, you would expect that the fatalities, they're up now. You can see that in the data. They're up from a month ago, and that's what you would expect, but they're not up by that much. And that's in line with what my argument, that once you've been exposed once, you may be reinfected, but very unlikely that it will be severe. Right. So even though South Africa has a low actually very low vaccination rate, they have basically natural herd immunity, meaning there are not that many people now who would die if they are exposed to the virus. And therefore the fatalities, even at the peak of the season, will not be that high. But there will be more than above zero, of course. There will not be, I mean, there will be noticeably higher than a few months ago, but nothing as high as in the previous seasonal cycle. That would be the prediction, right? And the same here in Germany, not because of natural herd immunity, but because of vaccinated herd immunity. You would expect to see the same. So in September, you would start seeing some increase in fatalities, but not by much, right? If that is not the case, then my concept of the virus is fundamentally flawed, and I will have to reassess it. Let's see. So one reason I'm still tracking this and not yet getting tired of it, even though it seems a bit repetitive every month, is because I want to see what happens in autumn and winter. And only once we are through the next seasonal cycle, I think, do we have the full statistical, empirical evidence to validate our concept. Right? When I said earlier, some people can only think about empirical data and nothing else, I didn't mean to dismiss empirical data. I'm also very keen on empirical data, right? However, I'm starting with a concept, and then I gather the empirical data that I need to validate my concept. A lot of people seem to just wait for empirical data without having a concept. So they don't know what they're validating, right? So they don't really know what data they're looking for. Right? That's my criticism. Right? I'm not criticizing empirical data as such. I'm criticizing you if you are single-mindedly relying on empirical data without having a concept of what, or model in your mind as to what it is that you're testing for, then your empirical data will not tell you very much. And it will take a long time until, without a concept to impose on it, you can make sense of that empirical data, because empirical data will often be contradictory. You need to have a shining light, a lighthouse, that a beam that shows the direction. Okay, that lights up that data for you, right? Then the data becomes meaningful. A lot of people don't seem to have that. They just gather data, or they look at data. Numbers are up. Without a concept, maybe there's a good reason why the numbers are up, perfectly plausible and to be expected. So therefore, nothing remarkable and not even worth talking about, you see. People don't often have that, and then numbers are up. That has no meaning unless you can put it into some kind of a concept or a context, right, in which that acquires meaning. By itself, that data has no meaning. That's my point, right? So I am also keen on empirical data to see whether my concept holds up, my hypothesis, if you like, holds up to the empirical data, right? And where it doesn't, I'm willing to adjust my concept. But so far, the concept overall has stood up very, very well for 15 months now. So, but as I say, I think we need a full 24 months to really, have enough empirical data to say, yeah, it either does match the concept, or there are some issues here, somewhere it doesn't fully match. Let's try to understand why, and then see whether we have to adjust or even completely change our concept. Right? That's the process. And my feeling is we need 24 months to get to that. And we are now at, I don't know, 15 or 16 months. So still some way to go. All right, the last one that I was tracking in this way was the United States. Remember, their data over the whole summer last year were a bit higher than the green curve would predict. That's partially because they have different climate zones, is my guess, and therefore the pattern of the seasonality isn't exactly the same all over the 50 states. There are differences, and therefore you don't have as distinct a low and a high cycle as you would have in Sweden or Germany. I mean, Florida is tropical, Alaska is polar, and you have a lot of stuff in between. You have, dry regions in the middle. You have wet regions in the west and in the east, and in the southwest you have Mediterranean climate. I mean, you have quite a range of climate zones in the United States, and they will have different seasonal patterns. So it doesn't work like one country really. At least in terms of climate zones, right? And so that might explain why throughout, what you would call the summer in the Northern Hemisphere, in some places there was activity, it was lower, but it was not as low as in Sweden. Yeah. That's just simply maybe because Sweden is much more homogeneous as a country. Even Sweden isn't that homogeneous, right? It's quite a stretched out country, but most people live in temperate zones along the coast. And the colder parts of Sweden are barely inhabited. So you have to take those things into account, of course, in the US as well. So Alaska doesn't really count, to be honest. But yeah, so that's my intuitive explanation why the US had more activity over the summer, just because the seasonality pattern actually isn't as clear-cut as in Sweden. And also, yeah, it was quite liberal. I mean, people in many places, people behaved like normally. But so did the Swedes, but the Swedes had maybe a bit more discipline about it than the Americans, just because that was the policy to encourage that discipline. Yeah. Anyway, so the US is quite more or less in line with the green curve. And they also saved some lives since January, and they did it primarily with the vaccinations, less with any kind of additional measures. There may have been some additional measures in some places, New York, I remember, some other places, but generally I think they did it with the vaccination. So the early vaccinations in the US allowed them to save some lives relative to the projected green curve here, without imposing significant new measures. Whereas in Sweden, around the same time, they didn't yet have the vaccine quite there, but they imposed the measures to buy time until the vaccines were there. So it's a similar curve with a slightly different explanation. At the moment, US fatalities are a bit higher than the green curve. But again, that's mirroring what happened last year. So again, that may be that the seasonal cycles in the US just play out differently. They overlay with some kind of sequentiality to them. And so therefore the whole seasonality gets more stretched out. And you never get a real low season, and you never get a really super high season. It's more sort of in between. There is a movement, but it's less oscillating than it is in Sweden, if that's the word, right? So that's, I think, what we're seeing in the United States. But that's all good. Again, nothing much will happen over the next couple of months. And then in autumn, the litmus test, whether the fatalities go up significantly, which we don't expect, or not, which is what we expect. Divergence, remember 4 buckets of countries, normal, Sweden, back to normal, countries that generally have not imposed too many restrictions and are apparently quite keen to go back to normal. The classification is a bit iffy. UK, for example, very high vaccination rates, already pretty high natural herd immunity, and still they're reluctant to get rid of the restrictions. So actually they're not at the moment very keen to go back to normal, surprisingly, and I don't quite get it. So, maybe UK should be in the muddled through category, right? So bear with me. I don't want to keep changing these classifications. They're very rough and ready. And whether every country is in the right bucket, I don't want to argue about. But generally speaking, back to normal countries are the ones where you would expect that either by natural herd immunity or by quick vaccination, quick rollout of vaccinations, they're really trying to get to the point where they have effective herd immunity. And effective herd immunity is a combination of natural herd immunity plus overlaying on that the vaccinated herd immunity, right? With some overlap. I've talked about that before. I don't want to repeat my methodology there, but I'm trying to not double count, right? If someone had already been infected and then gets vaccinated, the vaccination is lost in a way, but not entirely maybe, because there's an argument that the vaccination gives you some additional protection by further, stimulating your immune system. That may be the case, and I don't want to argue with that. But for simplicity, I'm saying if you had been infected before, you no longer need a vaccine. And if you are getting the vaccine, it's wasted. So I'm not double counting that herd immunity, right? Otherwise, you would again be above 100% at some point. And herd immunity also is a number that cannot go above 100%. And I've defined a level of herd immunity where it becomes meaningful at 80% of population penetration. And that's just based on some of the countries I've been observing, where it seems that at about 80%, really, you do see a flattening. It's very hard to tell, to be honest. Right? And remember, people talk about 70%, 90%, 80%, somewhere in that region. So I've settled on 80% without any claim for precision or that. It's just a heuristic. But with that, if you take together the infection ratio, you take the vaccination ratio, and I'm counting single shot already, because even a single shot already is very highly effective, 80% or so, in preventing you from falling severely ill. So even if you are in the at-risk group, and let's say your likelihood of falling severely ill is, let's say, 20% or whatever I had calculated for Mr. Trump, remember last year when he went in the hospital, I calculated, a little bit below 20%, I think his likelihood of falling severely ill. You put a vaccination on top of that, let's say he hadn't been naturally insulated yet. So you put a vaccination on top of that kind of person, so the 20% is lowered by 80%, right? So you're at 4%. So it's a very, very significant reduction of your risk, even the first shot. Then the second shot takes that up to 98%. Also depends a bit on the vaccine, but very high. With 2 shots is very high, but even 1 shot already pretty high. And therefore, most observers that are tracking this, they are talking about full vaccinations, and they are really counting those. And the percentage of population that has been fully vaccinated, fine. I don't do that because I believe the first vaccination is the key. The second one is kind of nice to have. But it depends on how the vaccines operate and what they exactly found in the testing periods, which I don't know in detail for all the vaccines. So I'm not arguing with people who say no, only full vaccination should be counted. I'm just saying my sense is you've got vaccinated once, that already triggers your immune system. And remember, that's all it needs to do: trigger your immune system to start producing some of the right neutralizing antibodies, and then you're already very well protected. And that's why I count both those who had 2 shots and plus those who had only 1 shot. They're in there. So those are the vaccination rates for different countries. And you can see some countries are now reaching 50, 60, near 70% vaccination rates, right? Some countries, you're seeing a slowdown in vaccinations, US, some European countries. And that is something that you would hope to see in free countries, where you would wish to see that a lot of people don't take up this option, right? That's healthy. So if the vaccination rates are capped somewhere around 50%, let's say, in some countries, and they start not going up anymore because not many people come forth and want to be vaccinated, that's actually healthy. It means there are some people who can think, and they realize they don't need this vaccine, right? And it means that there are some countries in which people aren't forced through vaccination passes, for example, to get vaccinated against their will, right? So that's healthy. I know a lot of healthcare professionals, not many, some people don't want to be vaccinated. Oh, that's terrible. No, that's good. Remember, most of us don't need to be vaccinated. And they're taking advantage of their right to refuse a vaccination or to not desire or to demand a vaccination and not take it. That's good. So I'm glad to see that's happening in some countries, but only in some countries. Yeah, you have some other countries, Japan, for example, that only recently started to really realize if you don't vaccinate some amount of people, you're stuck in your circular thinking, the one that Singapore broke out with their new narrative, right? That circular thinking of hammer wait, hammer, wait, hammer, wait, hammer, wait. So government in Tokyo has decided to want to break out of that vicious cycle that they got themselves into by vaccinating people. Right? I think the Olympics may be an additional trigger, which is sort of good. I mean, as terrible as their restrictions around the Olympics are, it's mind-boggling what restrictions they're putting on the participants, but it has triggered something maybe in the minds of the politicians about, well, maybe we should just vaccinate people after all. Yes, you should, right? At least those who need it, right? Voluntarily, ideally. Okay, anyways. So you have countries like Japan, South Korea, who have had good activity. India has really ramped up significantly over the last months. So that's good to see. So you have some countries that are really reaching some kind of saturation point where a lot of people say, thank you, no, thank you. I don't, especially young people, then why should I get vaccinated? Right, you shouldn't. But you also have still some countries which are only really starting to roll out an effective vaccination program. And then you have still some other countries which I think they haven't even really started, like the Philippines. So you have this prime minister there who, who threatens people with jail and worse if they don't wear a mask or if they refuse the vaccination. But he is not rolling out vaccinations at all. So it's just rhetoric. But there were no vaccinations available in the Philippines, so people don't need to refuse them because they're not there, right? So hopefully next month, they're ramping up. But so some countries are very much behind the curve in, vaccinating people, and you see that the number of months to reaching herd immunity, you still see a big spread, right? The spread is shrinking thanks to vaccines. Remember, before vaccines came, we had countries that would have needed 100 months to get to herd immunity naturally, right? So the vaccinations, of course, speed up time to herd immunity for all countries, and especially for those who have been hammering down on the virus a lot, right? Whereas some countries, Iran, Mexico, Peru, South Africa, the vaccines are almost coming too late, right? They had already reached the natural herd immunity by the time the vaccines really came. Not entirely, right? So they, as I keep saying every time, they still should roll out vaccines to those who need and want them. And even if they are not sure that the person maybe was already infected, and yes, we give them a vaccine on top, yes, it may not count because it's not really effective. They already have the immunity they need, but it doesn't matter. It's not going to do any harm, right? So just give it to them. If you don't have enough antibody tests because you could test for that, right? Or you don't trust it because after 6-9 months the antibodies disappear again, just give them the vaccine. That's okay. Vaccines are available, they're cheap, they're effective. There's no reason to withhold vaccines from all those people who might benefit from them. Yeah, and give them the benefit of the doubt. And yes, you are only 55, but yeah, I give it to you anyways if you want it. Yeah, sure. Give it to everybody who wants it, even a teenager. If a teenager says, I want it, give it to them. Why would a teenager want it? There's really only one good reason. Yeah, well, two. One is they are paranoid. Two, they want to travel, and they've realized, or do some other things like go to the cinema, and they realize that governments will demand those COVID certificates from them, right? That's the only reason for these young people to want to be vaccinated, is because they're forced to. They don't actually want to, but they are forced to. Yeah, so we'll see how that pans out, but I think globally it's slowing down a bit, but that's not a bad sign. Again, that just means that quite a lot of countries are now reaching a level where they've done their job. They're done. If they've reached herd immunity here, it's not exactly the same metric, but you can assume those who have herd immunity here, they have pretty much protected everybody who needs protection, right? Maybe some people will just not get that protection, and there will always be some people who will die, right? Just like with influenza, or even very, very rarely with other cold viruses, right? That people just die anyways because their immune system misfires, right? That will never go away, right? But the numbers will be so low that everybody can live with them quite happily. That's just a fact of life. Okay. So our data, remember 60% now of humanity have been exposed. I mean, this is infections, this is natural infection. 60% have had the natural infection, and that number will go eventually towards near 100%. It is slowed down by vaccinations, of course, but it's not changed by vaccinations. It's only slowed down. Eventually, these people who have been vaccinated will still probably get naturally infected anyways, right? Because the vaccines are not fully effective against being infected. They are very effective against getting seriously ill with COVID, but they're not so effective in preventing you from getting an infection with the SARS-CoV-2, and they don't need to. So sooner or later, even if you repeatedly get vaccinated, you will eventually get this virus anyways, right? It just, you won't notice. But, you know, basically 100% of us will sooner or later have this virus. And we'll reach a saturation level of near 100%. There will, some exceptions may always exist in some very remote places or what have you, right? But you know, almost all of us will eventually have been infected by this virus at least once, right? The second data point says the infection ratio is a slightly different metric. It counts all infections. So that's already more than 60% because surely there are now already quite a lot of people who have their second infection. We normally don't know that because unless they happen to have had a PCR test the first time, they don't know that they had been previously infected, right? So, and they don't notice a second infection either, or they think it's another cold, right? So the infection ratio is already higher than 60%. The first number up there is the first infection. And the second number here is the total infections. And the total infections are already above 60%, but we don't know what it is. I don't know what it is. I have no way of estimating how many second infections we already have. And next year we'll have third infections and fourth infections and so on, right? And if you assume that all of us on average get infected by this virus 10 times in our lives, you will have 1,000% infection ratio eventually. But it's harmless, right? It's just a statistic. I'm just putting this up because still a lot of people don't seem to realize they're still counting cases and they think that's meaningful. But when you look at these figures, it's completely meaningless. You don't even know whether it's a first infection or a second infection. You can't even distinguish those, right? But that's a very different quality. At least in my conception, the first one can be risky. The second one will almost never be risky, right? So it's a completely different quality of infection. And the first infection and the second infection, they're both infections, but they're not the same thing at all, right? But your counting doesn't separate them. And you could only separate them by doing an antibody. If someone tests positive for the virus, then you would have to do an antibody test to see whether they're also testing positive for antibodies. Then you know, oh, this is already the second infection, right? But by and large, that's never done, right? So you don't know, is it the first infection or the second infection, right? By now, we are 15 months into this, it may well be a second infection. Yeah, that's why I keep saying the case numbers don't matter. You have to look at fatalities, maybe at hospitalizations, and if you want to manage the healthcare system, then you have to anticipate based on seasonality, what are the hospitalizations we need to expect, and then we can, invest in that and prepare for that. I mean, we could have done that. We already knew or anticipated the seasonality last March or April. Remember, I shared a letter to Frau Merkel from, I think, early June, where I pointed out this is the seasonality and you can prepare for it. Prepare for the winter now. Obviously, Germany did not, right? I mean, that could have saved a lot of lives if they had, right? So, yeah, you can if you look at fatalities, you look at hospitalizations, you look at the seasonality of the virus, and you can manage this thing, but cases don't matter. But by now, still almost all governments around the world on a daily basis, oh, man, the number of cases is up. It's useless. I know I repeat myself, but even Singapore and maybe Australia are now starting to make noises as if they're starting to realize that cases don't matter. Let's see. 1% of all infected people get severely ill. That number, that's in the first encounter. And once everybody has encountered the virus or has encountered the vaccine, that will drop to near zero. That's why I'm saying eventually there will be very few fatalities from this, just like other common cold viruses. Not zero, but few. And the percentage of those who get infected who die, now the IFR, as I said, I've put it up by 1 percentage point, it's 0.2%, but that will also drop, of course, near zero, right? And thanks to the vaccines, because the vaccines accelerate the herd immunity, right? And they shortcut. So many countries will avoid having to get everybody through natural herd immunity thanks to the vaccines. We should expect, so the calculated COVID fatalities would be 12.85 million based on a 0.2 IFR. But we can now expect that our COVID fatalities will be less than that, right? And that's thanks to the vaccines. More statistics or conceptual things. Number of people killed by SARS-CoV-2, 0. The virus doesn't kill anybody. I keep saying that. A number of people killed by their compromised immune systems. That's the number we're actually counting. Yeah, they're not COVID victims. They're compromised immune systems victims. But I do recognize that this virus triggers that misfiring of the immune system. Yes, it has something to do with the virus. Yes, but other viruses could also trigger that misfiring of the immune system. So here's one thing I wanted to just sort of, it was on my mind recently, and I just wanted to, I don't know whether I've said it before, but I say it now. So just because it needs to be said. I remember last year there were people who said, when the first data was available, maybe May, June, July, first data from Europe about the typical age ranges in which the fatalities sort of clustered. And the average age of COVID fatalities in some countries at the time was just under 80, I think. And then someone did a back of the envelope quick calculation and said, oh, based on what a 17, so let's say the average is 79 years old, the average, some of them are male and female, you have to sort of distinguish that, but okay. The average 79-year-old has another 8 or 9 years statistically life expectancy. So because there had been some arguments that some people said, oh, these measures are excessive because even if we're saving lives, these are lives that only have a few years left living on average, which is actually a true argument. It's not, we're not kidding here, right? That is true. The lives you're saving are typically lives that only have a few years left, right? So you need to take that into account when you try to juxtapose that to all the lives you're negatively affecting with your measures, right? So someone pointed that out. And the response by this person was, no, it's not just a few years, it's 8 or 9 years on average, these people still have to live. Because the average 79-year-old in those countries that they looked at had another 8 or 9 years to live, statistically. Unfortunately, that is wrong thinking, right? Because the ones who are dying are people, by definition almost, who have compromised immune systems. So their life expectancy is not average. So if the average person of their age has 8 or 9 years left to live, these people do not. Clearly, right? Because their immune system isn't working well. So if this virus hadn't killed them, maybe the next influenza would have killed them or something else, right? We don't know, right? I'm just saying statistically, the life expectancy of this subcategory of 79-year-old, namely those who died of COVID or in conjunction with COVID, those 79-year-olds had a lower, by definition, had a lower life expectancy than the average cohort of the 79-year-olds, right? So I just wanted to say that because maybe I never said that, but that thought occurred to me a long time ago, and then I didn't think of it, and recently, for some reason, it occurred to me again. These people that you are saving are people almost by definition living with compromised immune systems. Now, what does it mean? We don't know. Maybe they wouldn't have died of an infection at all. They would have died of cancer 10 years later. Yeah, we don't know, right? But statistically, their life expectancy can only be lower than the average of their age group. It cannot be otherwise, because these are the vulnerable ones. Remember, they are not average people. They are well above average in terms of vulnerability to a virus. Okay, so therefore the life expectancy cannot have been average. It must have been less than average. Okay, by how much less than average, we don't know. Right? But I just wanted to say that here. So these are people. I mean, you know, it is important to remember we die anyways, and we all have a certain lifespan which we don't know. And yes, we all have an instinct to try to extend that life as long as we can, at least in most cases we do, right? And it is precious to us. And who are we to determine whether 5 more years, how precious are they to that individual person? Of course, we cannot, it's not to us to judge that. And yes, you could say, but every year that we've saved, or every day that we've saved is worth something. Yeah, I'm not denying that. I'm just saying you're at the moment destroying 8 billion lives for 15 months now already. That's a lot of man years affected. And yeah, you're not destroying them entirely, but you're severely disrupting them and lowering their value very significantly, right? So you need to have some kind of balance. That's the word I used earlier. I don't think there's any balance right now in these judgments, right? So these are people who in the next few years very likely would have died anyways. Yeah, that is not to say we shouldn't help them as well as we can. As I always say, we could have helped them a lot better, and I'm all in favor of that. But we are not helping them very effectively, and we're doing it the wrong way. That's the point. Right? But yeah, we have had 7.7 fatalities according to the model right now. On the current IFR, expected fatalities would be 12.85. So we are still 5 million and a bit short. We had about 60% of expected fatalities. And, you know, as I said before, the vaccines, you know, lower that curve. They flatten that curve. In real life, it cannot go down, but it can flatten, right? And it will not approach the 12.85 million. It cannot, because the vaccines do have an effective, a real effect, measurable effect, right? So, so the good news is, thanks to the vaccines, this number here, the number of people killed by their compromised immune systems, will not reach 12.8. It will be less. Where exactly we will sort of plateau, I don't know yet, but you know, probably well below the 12.8. Yeah, we are already seeing some of that plateauing now, right? However, you have to also, if you like, contrast or put that into perspective with those numbers who were killed by errors, including unintended errors that were unavoidable, but also real, I mean, mistakes made by governments in terms of their impositions, right, which killed additional people. And I talked about that many times before. And these errors and you know, wrong-headed policies and impositions, by my reckoning, have killed 3.4 million people. And you know, the not so good news is that this figure, and yes, it's risen significantly since last time because of the Peru data. So maybe that's a bit biased on the upside now. And if I get some additional data, maybe it comes down a little bit again, you know, yeah, possible. But at the moment, based on what I know, this 3.4 million isn't that much short of the 5. So those are net additional deaths that were avoidable, or that, you know, that are not due to the immune systems, but rather to policy errors, both tactical and strategic policy errors. This number is approaching now the number that we are sort of saving. The 5 million that we are falling short of what it naturally would be. Now, we're still having fatalities every day, so this number is bound to get smaller, unless I have to change my model again. You know, but taking those things apart, the trend is clearly for this number to get smaller, not zero, luckily, as I said, but smaller. And there is a break-even point where the number saved becomes even equal to the numbers, murdered. And I'm putting both words into apostrophes, okay? You know what I mean, right? So 3.3 million, 3.4 million are murdered by wrong-headed policy, and the 5.15 million are saved by government measures and vaccines, right? And we may have a situation in the end when the dust settles where the number of saved is less than the number murdered, which means if the government had done nothing, we actually would have had less fatalities. That would be a really, really horrendous outcome, because then not only are all these suspensions of our rights and liberties, conceptually wrong, if you like, or legally wrong, or ethically wrong, they didn't even do anything to net save lives. They did not, right? And we are getting closer to that break-even situation. So we'll see how it pans out, but I'm flagging that now. The number murdered is already 65% of the number saved, right? And the number saved is going to go down, and the number murdered is currently higher. So the number saved is here, and the number murdered is here, but the trend is this, right? And we may well at the end have a situation where they are almost indistinguishable, and you have to conclude the measures taken all together had zero effect on the number of man days lived. That's the metric, zero. We may well end up with zero effect, meaning all this drama and all these suspensions of rights and all these crimes against humanity committed by governments in the last 15, 16, 17, of course, and running months will have been to no purpose. That would be shocking. I don't quite expect that, and I would be a bit surprised by it, because the vaccines do have an effect that is undeniable. And it's a bit hard to believe that so many people were killed by government measures. I mean, unnecessarily killed by government measures, that it offsets the effect, the beautiful effect of the vaccine. So I still doubt that, and maybe the 3.4 million here is at the moment a bit inflated because of the Peru effect, because they built that in. So continue tracking this, and hopefully there will be at least some measurable net savings of life, right? Otherwise, I would be really frustrated. All this terror for absolutely nothing, right? But it's a possibility that all this terror that the governments imposed on us was worth nothing, right? Now, the governments will, of course, say, yeah, that's worldwide, but we don't care because we are responsible only for this, one country, right? Yeah, that's what they will do, right? But I've always maintained from the very beginning that the nation state has absolutely nothing to do with this. This is a global, this should have been a global response, a very measured global response. We would have saved a lot of lives at very low cost. It is so easy. The only thing in the way is the mindset of nation states and national governments. We must act. Even though we don't know what we're doing, but we must act. Yeah, yeah. All of us are being still taken hostage. I mean, there's no drop of this number, and of course, this is 99%. I don't know, but this virtually all of us are being affected, some more than others, and there's no light at the end of the tunnel, really. Although a lot of governments are talking about loosening the measures. I mean, the normal is that anybody can go anywhere they like at any time they like, to any country they like. That's the norm. Now, I know even before COVID, a lot of people couldn't get a passport or they couldn't get a visa. And, so the world, even before COVID, was restrictive in terms of movement of people. I know that, but at least we have to be able to get back to that unsatisfactory situation before COVID. But we are far from even getting nearer to that position pre-COVID, to that what we used to call normal. There's virtually no opening up in terms of travel, except maybe in the European Union now. where by law, by Schengen agreement, they have to be open to each other. So for them, it's even harder to keep the state of exception up than any other country. But that's within the EU. But to third countries, that doesn't apply, right? So the third countries, they can still close it off. And they, they keep adding countries to the list and then taking them off the list and adding other countries to the list based on these completely meaningless case numbers. So I mean the terror continues. So I'm not seeing any real improvement yet. Maybe here and there small marginal improvements, but the overall picture is we're still in the state of exception. Right? By the end of this year, early next year, we'll have had basically 14 billion sort of man-years severely disrupted by this. So there's absolutely no balance compared to the relatively small number of man-years that we may have saved, extended rather, right? There's absolutely no balance. The numbers are so different. There's no way of balancing them. The economic cost, again, there's absolutely no relationship between these costs, which are humongous, and to some people this is about life and death, right? It's not just the luxury of, oh, okay, this year maybe I cannot go on my cruise ship. It's not, for some people it's about life and death, right? These economic and social costs are in absolutely no relationship to what they bought us. They bought us almost nothing, as I say. It's basically, it's just wasted, destroyed. It's a destruction of wealth. Yeah, and not only are we not seeing really a light at the end of the tunnel in terms of the state of exception, but there is a possibility that some of the measures we are now inventing, these vaccine passports, or so, they will stay with us forever, and not only in authoritarian or totalitarian states, but everywhere. Right? In terms of vaccination progress, remember 1% of the population really fall ill. That's 79 million people. Yes, we don't know exactly who they are. We only know statistically roughly in which category they are. So we have those so-called risk groups that are heuristic. And if we add them all together, there's overlap between them. Or if we try to figure that out, we get to about 13% globally of people who we should call at risk, right? That's about 1 billion people. Those 1 billion people should get vaccinated if they want, right? There's a clear benefit for them to be vaccinated, right? And because we have those heuristics, we can identify them quite clearly, right? Over 65 years, diabetic, obese. Yeah, so it's quite simple, right? One could individually identify them. I mean, not perfectly, of course, by age, yes, because government has that register, but whether someone is obese or diabetics, that the government cannot know, but they have to just come forth, by themselves, right? So it's not, the onus is not on the government to identify them, they have to self-identify, right? The onus on the government is just to inform them. If you have this, and this, or this characteristic, please come forth, right? We give you a free vaccine, don't worry, it's totally harmless, a vaccine, and it can really save you your life, right? Because you're in a risk group. I mean, it's so simple, right? Most people could understand that if the government had this kind of simple communication, but unfortunately they don't know how to communicate simply. They only know how to communicate in convoluted ways. So anyways, 19% of global population have at least received one jab. This is excluding China, because that's in my model, and I'm not including China in my model. So those two numbers don't compare them directly, because the 13%, the 1 billion includes China, and the 19% here excludes China, right? But so in the world, excluding China, 1.2 billion people have already received at least one jab. So we basically already have overachieved what needed to be done. Basically, in theory, we would be done by now, except there are a lot of cases where we've given the vaccine to the wrong people who don't need it, right? So unfortunately, otherwise we would be done by now. If we had rigorously worldwide allocated the vaccines to those 1 billion people who have any kind of measurable risk, then it would be done by now. Unfortunately, a lot of governments chose to give the vaccines to people who don't need them, so we are probably not done. Some countries don't have the vaccines yet, or very little, right? Other countries are already massively over-vaccinating people who don't need it, yeah. So misallocation of the scarce resource of vaccine. Now, luckily, the vaccine will soon not be scarce. It's already, we are getting to a point where maybe it's no longer scarce, right? Because some countries already, like the US, generously, we have to say, is giving them away to third countries because they already have too much, right? And Europe, I think, should be in that position pretty much by now or soon. So these vaccines, since they are easy to produce, more or less easy to administer, and some of them need cooling and difficult supply chains, but generally, not too complex. Yes, we will get them to all of these or almost all of these 1 billion people. But before the end of this year, maybe we'll probably get them to pretty much all of these 1 billion people who need them. Now, we will have vaccinated 3 billion people in order to hit the 1 billion, just because we are so inefficient and ineffective in how we administer or to whom we administer them. But we will get there. I had previously said in my scenario, we could have done that by 1st July. By today, we could be done. We chose not to be done. That's just, again, just one of those choices. By leaving it to individual governments, instead of saying, let's do this just as a global team, right? We just give it really, wherever the people are, doesn't matter. We give it to those who statistically need it. And then, that's it. It's so easy, right? But it's so difficult, apparently, for national governments to do that. In fact, it's probably impossible for national governments to do that because every government thinks they know better than all the others. And I said before, that's statistically impossible. On average, every government is exactly average. But of course, nobody likes to be average. They don't know, but we are smarter. Yeah, and so maybe some countries are smarter than others, but it just makes the overall outcome worse than it could have been. Yeah, it's irrational, but it's bounded rationality, as Herbert Simon called it, I think, right? And it's satisfying, right? Within a very limited definition of rationality, it's rational. I'm elected by the people of this country. I'm responsible for this country. I don't care what's happening on the other side of my border. Those people I'm not responsible for. I don't, I just optimize within my little sandbox. Even though, 200 different countries all optimizing within their little sandbox, overall gives a really, really shitty result. They do it anyways, because their rationality ends at the boundaries of the sandbox, just like the rationality of an expert, so-called, ends at the boundaries of their discipline, right? And so we will never, for any global challenges, we'll never get very good results. We'll get somewhere eventually, in some way. Global warming, yeah, we'll probably, instead of having 2 degrees, we'll have 1.5. Maybe, or instead of 3, we will have 2 or whatever. So we'll muddle through and we'll get somewhere, but never to a very good result. Okay. Okay, one more thing, and then I'm done. This new set of scenarios, just to play around a bit. Long-term scenarios, very long-term. 2 axes. Trust in the immune system. On the one extreme, it's completely lost. I mean, obviously right now it's low, right? I mean, we are in this period where most people don't seem to trust their own immune system. At least they behave as if they don't trust the immune system. But let's say one extreme would be it's entirely lost. We no longer trust our immune systems at all. And at the other extreme, it recovers, and we are getting back to a normal state where a normal being, intuitively trusts the immune system, right? Knowing that sometimes it malfunctions, like we are, like all living beings, are not perfect by definition, but we intrinsically trust our immune system. And on the vertical, we have trust in our mental faculties. So obviously at the moment, we have a situation where most people don't seem to trust their own ability to think, or they are not practicing thinking. They have not had a lot of experience thinking. They trust more in politicians or experts or technocrats or some other authority than in their own mental faculties. That seems to be the current situation. Now in this scenario, it goes in one extreme, it's completely lost. People just simply completely lose the ability even, or the will to trust in their own mental faculties. And on the other extreme, it recovers and we go back to, where maybe Homo sapiens was, just a few hundred or a few thousand years ago, when people were still very much dependent on their own ability to think, to survive, right? Of course, most people today can survive without thinking, right? Because someone else does the thinking for them, the government, organizations, companies, administrations, right? Everything is sort of just taking place without, some people, they never in their life probably have to do much thinking at all, and they can still survive. Because we have great systems and institutions that allow that, right? But what we've seen recently is that quite a high percentage of population seems to be out of training, at least in terms of using their mental faculties. I'm not saying the level of intelligence that is sort of, if you like, genetic is dropping yet. I'm not suggesting that. I don't have any evidence for that, and I think that would take quite some time. But I'm saying their propensity and their practical ability to apply what the brain actually allows them to do is lessened by their context in which they live, which is, education is all about just absorbing stuff without too much reflection. You can lead your life, you can have sort of a mid-level career, in this or that without too much thinking. Most things are taken care of by the government, your retirement, your education, everything is provided, healthcare, everything is provided for you. And, so, yeah. I mean, you don't really ever have to seriously think for yourself, right? If you don't want to. And it's not that people don't want to. I think people are naturally inclined to wanting to think, but this kind of context is really quite, it's putting you to sleep, right? It's not encouraging your mental faculties. And I think that, to me, at least, that was my insight from the last 15 months. That comes to the fore when you have a situation that is unusual, right? Like the COVID situation. And here, all of a sudden, thinking really helps, right? If we had all done a bit more thinking, it really would have made a big difference. But people are just not used to that, right? In many places, and because it's not required for them to live a decent life, right? And it's not easy to just activate it like that, right? If you haven't been used to practicing thinking, or consciousness, or your own will, imposing your own will within the limits of the law, etc., but within the limits of ethical considerations, but still having your own drive, right? And it's not that people don't have drives, but they may have drives in very particular areas, but not in others, right? And if you have this kind of globalized problem like COVID, which affects many different things in different ways, and which, as I said, is a global, not a local problem, then it's very hard to activate that part of your thinking capacity that can deal with that situation. Right? So anyway, so I'm not saying that thinking is completely gone, but it certainly hasn't been glorious in the last 15 months on the whole. And there's maybe a scenario where, or a trend where, more and more that mental faculties are, or rather, not necessarily the faculties themselves, but the trust in those faculties is lost. People just don't remember that they can think logically, that our brains are wired to think logically. But if people don't experience that in daily life, they don't realize that. It's my feeling, anyways. So, scenario one, called human revival, would be a scenario in which our trust both in our mental faculties and our immune systems revives and recovers. And that, as I said at the very beginning of this, to be fully human means to trust in your mental faculties and in your bodily faculties, especially your immune system in this situation. And that makes you truly human. Right? So that's why I call this scenario human revival. Then in the northwest quadrant, you have a scenario where our trust in our mental faculty recovers. Maybe a lot of people during the COVID period, for example, have started to think, have started to realize, oh, we cannot just simply take things for granted or at face value that, other people say. We should, in this kind of situation, we are called upon to create our own thinking and our own viewpoint on matters. And so they reignited, maybe even by this crisis. That could be a positive outcome of this crisis. It could be this crisis of humanity. I don't call it COVID crisis because COVID isn't a crisis. Humanity triggers the crisis. But this crisis we triggered could lead us to recover that trust. Right? It's possible. That would be a positive longer-term effect of this crisis potentially. Yet we might never again trust our immune systems. Right? How likely is that? Well, I don't know, because a lot of people don't seem to think about the immune systems at all. Most people still don't seem to realize that this is all about immune systems, this whole so-called crisis. Right? But let's say there is a scenario where trust in the immune system is lost, but trust in the mental faculties recovers. Then we would have what I call cyborg ascendancy, meaning more and more humans would choose to enhance their body with some kind of technology or another, right? Prosthesis, if you like. We are doing that. My glasses here, which I'm wearing all day, except when I sleep, are kind of a prosthesis, right? They're one that isn't built into my body, but it's almost become part of my body for me. It's almost second nature, right? I have a crown here, and one of my teeth broke off, and I have a crown. So that's a prosthesis. So I'm a little bit of a cyborg, right? And virtually all of us nowadays, or at least in so-called developed countries or rich countries, we have some kind of prosthesis or another. So we all, in some ways, moving towards being cyborgs. And even if it's not things that are, clothing protects our body, right? And our temperature, et cetera, et cetera. So, humans from the very early stages became to some degree cyborgs, which is we are using technologies to enhance our body functions. That's not new, that's not problematic, I think, but this would be an acceleration of that in a direction where we say, we now, for example, we now have to get vaccinated against, tons of things. We simply don't trust that our immune system can handle all these millions of viruses out there and bacteria and fungi and what else, right? And where a mentality kicks in. We're already getting vaccinated as children against a few so-called children's diseases, where one vaccination will hold for life, or at least for like 10 years. In the case of tetanus, 10 years, and then you need a booster. But where it makes sense to get that vaccination because the protection is good, and the loss to exposure of our immune system to challenges is probably limited. So, the immune system doesn't probably get hampered very much by that. So there's there's a certain amount of that vaccination that is like wearing clothing. I mean, it has a positive effect without any real negative side effects that we can see, right? But it could shift much more extremely to a point, and driven, for example, by COVID, where governments start saying, in order to be treated like a human being, you have to be vaccinated every year, every 9 months even, because in some cases the antibody count is already no longer detectable after 9 months, right? Let's say typically 12 months, more typical. So maybe the government will say 12 months, you have to get revaccinated, otherwise your vaccination passport expires. Then you get into a new territory here where you get haunted by, instead of just relying on your immune system, using technology, and yes, it's not built into your body, so whether you call it cyborg or not, but it becomes hardwired into your life, right? Oh, every year my regular shot. Of course, there are many people today living with these kinds of things, type 1 diabetics who have to inject themselves regularly and so on. I know that, right? And I'm not saying that that's a bad thing also, no. But I'm saying is we are moving from a point where it is reactive. So you really have a problem that can be life-threatening, and there we interfere, to proactive, which is, we'll just do it. We'll just demand by law that you do it, irrespective of the fact that almost nobody benefits from it. You see, that's a very big difference. That's a step from saying, in principle, I trust my immune system, but depending on my body, but I have a certain condition, and I know I need to take this medicine, or I need to take this injection, and then I'm fine. So I fundamentally still trust my body and my immune system, but I know for a specific reason it needs a bit of external assistance. On the left is a situation where we just fundamentally don't trust our immune system anymore. And I mean, living in Singapore, I can see that evolving in front of my eyes, because I can see children not being allowed to play outside because the parents think they could be exposed to some bacteria, or people literally washing their hands with what is it called, this antiviral or antibacterial kind of liquid all the time, right? So limiting the exposure of their body to these germs to such a degree that it stunts the development of the immune system potentially, right? That's where we are then moving towards the left. So this is not so implausible. I mean, I'm seeing it in front of my eyes, where I'm coming from. I'm seeing people systematically acting as if they are not trusting their own immune system, and they cannot picture that they could just live happily without all of that stuff. I mean, people take vitamin pills, people take whatever stuff, right? More and more, as if they don't trust that the natural nutrition, which is so rich in most places in the world today, doesn't give them enough vitamins. In fact, it does, and all this oversupply of vitamin is just lost, right? It just comes back out at the bottom, right? It's complete waste. But there's a mentality of, I need to protect myself ever more, and it leads you down a slippery slope towards the left on my chart here, where eventually you lose all trust in your immune system. And then you are fully dependent on these external means, right? And you're no longer autonomous as a human being, right? Without need. I'm not arguing with people who really have a condition where they might die or severely be affected if they don't have their medicine. Of course, I'm in favor of them having their medicine at their disposal, right? But this is different. This is by and large people who don't need any of that stuff, but they don't trust their own body. They trust more in technology than in their own nature. That's what that scenario there And then they become cyborgs, but they link their body to all kinds of mechanisms and apparatuses and syringes and tablets and whatever it is, right? They're completely wired up, at least, not, this is just an image, right? But completely surrounded by these technologies that by and large they don't actually need, but they just don't believe that. They don't trust that they don't need them. Okay, bottom right. So this is a scenario in which the opposite is sort of true. Trust in the mental faculties doesn't recover and gets lost, but trust in the body by and large recovers. I call that scenario the rise of embodied AIs. So basically humans are still human bodies, but their minds are increasingly powered by external devices, whether they're implanted into our brain or something that, I don't know. They can be external to us. And this is, again, not new, and we're already doing it. I mean, I'm talking to you via laptop. I mean, that laptop is very much an extension of my mental faculties, if you like, and even of my body. It's actually a little bit of both, right? It's both physical as well as mental. I'm speaking to you via a video recording. So there is already here an enhancement of my mental faculties with the help of tools, right? Plato, the philosopher in Greece, 2,500 years famously rejected writing. He was maybe not 100% serious. Plato could be a bit of a tricky character sometimes, which makes him very human. He may not have meant it completely seriously, but he, maybe half-jokingly, he said, writing is dangerous because it will lead to us losing our capacity for memorization. Yeah, it's a bit the same logic that I'm applying to our immune systems. And I say, if you don't expose yourself to germs, you will lose capacity of your immune system, right? Because it will atrophy. And Plato said something similar about writing. He said, if you can write something down and record it, then you don't have to memorize it, right? So you're not training your memory, and you will lose that capacity, right? Not entirely, but partially, right? So already 2,500 years ago, there were those first technologies that made someone like Plato worry that this externalization of our mental capacities into tools could lead to deterioration of our mental capacities. Right? It's not a new thought. Right? The thought is 2,500 years old at least. But we could see an acceleration of that now. Right? We could see people now that they see, oh, we can, work from home. Everything is digital. Everything, people start using the first AI kind of softwares, and before you know it, we are on a slippery slope towards a situation where we outsource almost every one of our mental faculties to some mechanism, some tool. Some software, some robot, some AI assistant or some avatar, right? All of these are in that direction. So this is not so much enhancing our physical body competence as we do with the cyborgs, but it's our enhancing our mental capacities with external things. And if the external use of the external tools enhances our brain activity, then that can be a good thing. I know that, and I'm not denying that either, right? That actually interacting with these tools can be stimulating for our mental capacities rather than the reverse, right? So I want to be a bit cautious here, right? And this is obviously a field that needs a lot of study, and I'm not at all deeply into that field. But conceptually, it can also really lead to us relying less and less on ourselves and becoming more and more dependent on external processing capacity, to the point where, we no longer trust our mental faculties, whether it's thinking, whether it's our consciousness, whether, it's our willpower. We just outsource everything to technologies or institutions. Again, I mean, I'm seeing some of that happening around us as we speak, right? So this is not science fiction or something like that, or pure dystopia or so. No, I see early signs of that, increasing at the moment. So I don't think this is so implausible. Where exactly it leads, I don't know. Right? I mean, technology evolves so fast; it's very hard to predict. But this tendency is there ever more, I think, than ever before. So Plato spotted something early on that probably initially had a very slow, gestation and evolution. But now we are in that exponential part of it, perhaps. I don't know that for a fact, but we may be in that exponential part where it's really taking off. So we better be mindful of it. What does it mean to our humanity? Are we still humans if we're down in that box, right? Or in that top left box? Okay, and then there's a fourth scenario where both trust in the mental and the bodily faculties is lost. And that's the age of robots, because in that scenario, we will basically hand it all over to the robots. Let them do. Yeah, they will rule the world, right? Like in the Matrix. Now that is really utopian, I think, or dystopian. But there is a possibility of us trusting neither our mental nor our physical bodily faculties, and thereby essentially dehumanizing ourselves. Right? I mean, there are already countries, and I'm not going to name any, where people are treated like robots and treat each other like robots. And, you wonder at some point, do they develop a consciousness of a robot? I don't know. I don't know, but I'm very worried. Now, I call this long-term scenarios. This is not something that happens overnight. So where are we today? As always, in a good scenario, we are in the midpoint as of 1st July 2021. Now, am I going to track this on a monthly basis? I don't know. I have to think about it. This is more like a years and decades than kind of time frame than months. But so different time scale than my other scenarios for the COVID situation, which sooner or later, eventually, I'll abandon that because somehow we'll get past that, I think. This is much more long-term here. So I don't know how to track that. My lifespan is too short to track this, but we'll see. I'll think about that. But I just wanted to leave this with you. And you might say, yeah, but what does it have to do with COVID? Only insofar COVID has triggered something in my mind. I usually spend my time reflecting on other things, writers like Kleist and Goethe and so on, and not about viruses and pneumonias and government policies, to be honest. I'm normally not really interested very much in government policies. I only got interested on this occasion because they affected me so personally, right? I can't move, I can't travel, I can't choose. I have to wear a mask when I step out of the door, right? Which is terrible for me, terrible. So I've only spent all this time reflecting on the COVID situation because it affected me so personally. But generally, that's not my field of reflection very much. But maybe that's changed now. Maybe I've recognized in the last 15, 16 months that humanity is fundamentally evolving, as it always has, of course, and always would, right, and should. But it is interesting to think about, well, insofar as we can influence that evolution, should we make more of an effort to understand it and potentially direct it more, right? And I'm of two minds, because on the one hand, I'm saying on the first slide, I'm saying a human is someone who trusts in nature. And of course, the natural and Gelassenheit with Heidegger, I mean, let it be, right? Let it take its course relax, lean back and enjoy the ride, right? Could be one, very plausible, philosophical response, sort of a combination of some Epicurean, enjoyment of life and some Stoic sort of accepting things the way they are, right? Some kind of combination of that could be a, perfectly plausible philosophical response in light of these developments, right? And maybe it's a very wise choice to do it that way. But some other part of me says, well, hold on. Having been so frustrated recently because of this COVID situation, and so not just frustrated, but shocked, deeply shaken by how easily governments suspend the most basic values that I took for granted ever since I was born, or ever since I became conscious of these values, right, as a young person, that I took for granted and unshakable, that they could be suspended like this because of some virus. Not because of the virus, because of the lack of ability to engage with the virus. That's right. The virus isn't at fault, right? It's our lack of ability to engage with even the most basic virus, right? Triggering this. I don't want to call it overreaction because that is too euphemistic a word, right? It's a complete misreaction, right? So that has shocked me deeply. And so now I'm a little bit more like, if I'm just doing that sort of leaning back and say, hey, I just enjoy my, why should I care too much about these things? Now I'm a little bit lean forward and thinking, well, maybe I should reflect a bit more on what we're doing here. And at least to try to understand it and, in my own mind, sort through it a little bit and understand, well, where are we heading? Do I like it? Does it suit me? Is there something I want to flag? Of course, my flagging something on YouTube videos has no effect, right? Or my letter writing to Mrs. Merkel has zero effect, right? But at least it gives me the feeling I'm engaged and I'm trying something, right? And I'm not just a bystander entirely and just letting it be. Right? So yeah, so I don't know yet, but I just put this up. And what I'm going to do with it, if anything, I will see. We'll see. With that, thank you and see you next month. Take care.